David Brewster here with Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is target tones. And it honestly blows my mind. You know, I've talked to a lot of students and friends and peers, and I've noticed a lot of conversations online, in comment sections and posts. But it blows my mind. There's a lot of guitarists out there that pick up their guitar and they start playing a solo or a lead or some licks, and they have no idea, what notes they're playing, what scale, they're playing notes from. As the chords and the progression change, they don't really change with the progression. They just kind of lock into something on the fretboard and kind of blindly play, like out of a box or a position or a shape. And that's not a good thing. You definitely want to have at least, you don't have to know every single detail of everything that you're playing, but you at least need to have like a working knowledge or just some loose idea of what's going on as far as, targeting things over a chord progression, playing through scales or arpeggios and kind of matching, with chords and chord progressions in a song. And that's what this lesson's going to focus on. And I actually do have a book called Target Tones. It's from Centerstream, which is distributed through Hal Leonard. So you can find this, anywhere you can find Hal Leonard books, either online or in stores. But Target Tones dives a lot deeper than what this video is going to dive into. We're just really going to scratch the surface here. But if you like this concept and some of the things we're kind of flirting with, then I highly recommend, check out the book, Target Tones. And I did include the heads-up images at the beginning. This lesson's in drop D tuning, and I'm also going to be using the TC Electronic Ditto looper pretty extensively during this lesson. And that's really important. If you have a looper or a recording device or a friend that plays guitar, or maybe a piano or something, just some sort of chord-based instrument that you can play with or play over to really get an earful of what we're doing here, because you really need the chord, ringing or sounding behind you before you really can hear and understand what we're doing. So whether you loop it or record it or you have a friend play it, it's essential. Make sure you have these chords behind you. Let's pick D as far as the key and D minor as far as the tonality. And I'm just going to put the first chord right here. Just D minor, kind of close to open position right there. And this strategy I'm going to start with here, we're going to put the chords lower on the fretboard, and then we're going to start to investigate, some scale and licks and some lead ideas in a higher position. So we're going to separate and spread, this kind of distance between the chords and the lead. And that's something you probably want to think about and do, when you're writing solos or improvising or jamming. Try to stay away from where the chord is, and then investigate and play, maybe somewhere higher if the chord's lower, or if the chords are higher on the fretboard, then you might want to investigate some lower ideas too. But the first thing we're going to do here, I'm just going to loop that D minor chord. Just kind of a simple, pattern. And then right here, there's D minor pentatonic, right? Just one octave. All right, there's your root, flat third, the fourth, the fifth, that A, the flat seven, that C, and then the D right there. So all I was doing there is just playing with that D minor, little pocket of D minor pentatonic notes. But the important thing there is, you know where the root is. The root is obvious. Obviously, if you're playing over a D minor chord, the note D is going to sound great. It's the most transparent, safest note you can play. But the root's also kind of boring, right? It fits too perfectly. It doesn't really create any tension. It doesn't create any interest. It just sounds like you're at home, right? Right? It has a very final kind of sound. Now, what about the other notes in that chord? The F and the A of that D minor chord? F is the third, the minor third, and A is the fifth. So the fifth, that's the second note of a D power chord or a D5. So you know that A is going to work and it's going to sound good because it's part of the very common, you know, power chord. But it also, you know, in this kind of little pocket of notes we've been looking at, you know, that fifth is going to sound great, that A note. Just kind of playing around, totally just improvising. That wasn't scripted or you know, planned out or anything like that. But anyway, right there, I'm just kind of targeting those A's right there, you know, in this position. And I was also bending to it. So that's one thing you want to do when you're, you know, maybe mapping out a solo or coming up with some ideas for a guitar solo, is really map out an area that you want to put your solo. If you know your chord's going to be down here somewhere, and you want to play around with some lead ideas here, you know, there's obviously the D minor pentatonic box right there. You know, we're in drop D, of course, there. But, you know, you can also kind of extend and expand that into other positions, you know, maybe kind of play around with this. And now I'm starting to kind of drift into D minor, like D natural minor or Aeolian. You know, a 7-note scale instead of a 5-note scale. Now, as soon as you start moving away from pentatonics and you start moving into, you know, 7-note scales, major, minor scales, modes, and things like that, harmonic minor, melodic minor, there's a ton of options there. You have more notes, but that also means you have more melodic options, you know, over chords and chord progressions. But for this, we're still just on D minor as far as what we're playing over. So really just kind of map out this area, whether you're here, or if you want to think more pentatonic, like here. But really map that area out and find, okay, there's D, there's an octave of D right there. We can also grab the C and bend that to D. You know, so really map out that area and find, you know, your root notes for D. And then you can start thinking of that F that's a part of the chord. Right? You know, there's your F right there. You know, on the top of that shape right there. To the fifth. And of course you can bend that G, like I said earlier, up to A. Now if you want to expand your thinking here, think of a D minor 7 chord. Alright, now we got a 4-note chord instead of a triad like we had earlier. 7, we're going to have D, we're going to have F, we're going to have A and C is the flat 7 right there. And you can play that all over the place, you know. But right there, if you look at the notes of that chord, you know, we've got 4 notes, and there's 5 notes in the D minor pentatonic scale. So really, you know, a D minor 7 chord is just 1 note away from D minor pentatonic. We're just missing the 4th, you know, this G. Because there's your D, you know, there's your F, there's your A, and there's your C. And those are the 4 notes of D minor 7. To realize that if you're playing over minor 7th chords and you start playing minor pentatonic, you're really just playing, you know, the exact same notes, just adding the 4th, that G. Now speaking of G, let's actually add a G minor chord to the progression. So we're going to play a 1-4 in D minor. and that's going to be D minor, to G minor, like that. And that's actually the G I'm preferring right there too. You could play like the full bar down here if you wanted to, but I'm just kind of keeping it next door to that D minor I was playing with. Something like that. So now we're actually playing a chord progression instead of just a static chord. But if I loop that little riff right there, something like that. But that's introducing, a second chord to the mix, that G minor, which is the 4 chord, in D minor. So we can still use, D minor pentatonic. And you start looking at G minor, and you've got G, you've got D, and B flat are the notes here. G and D, that's the root and the 5th, right? And then that B flat's basically the minor 3rd of G minor. So if you start thinking of, D minor pentatonic here, you're going to notice there's no B flat in there. We've got, a G, and we've also got the D, obviously, because that's the root. But we're missing that B flat, so we're going to start to introduce that into the scale. So now think of D minor pentatonic, but we're going to add B flat, like this. So as far as targeting over that 2-chord progression, we kind of know what to do over the D minor. You can play notes like D, F, and A to target appropriately over that chord. And of course you can mix in some of the other notes too. You don't have to just limit yourself to those 3 notes. But then over G minor, you're going to notice like we have G, B flat, and D. So there's 3 notes there, G, B flat, and D, and 2 of those notes are actually in that minor pentatonic scale. There's your G, and then there's a D in there because D was the root of D minor. So there's the G and the D, but there is one note that we're missing there, that B flat. Now if we think back to D natural minor, we're going to find that B flat right here. There's your B flat in, D Aeolian or D natural minor. Well, now what we want to do is think of that D minor pentatonic, and we're going to add that B flat to it, like this. Kind of like a passing tone, in that minor pentatonic scale. But we're going to save that note too. You don't really want to worry about playing that B flat over the D minor. You want to save it for that G minor. And when you save that note and then play it over the right chord, it's going to pop out. We're targeting that note, this B flat. And over G minor, that's the 3rd. So that's the very expressive note that I was talking about earlier too. So we can do something like this. Purely improvising right there, just jamming around. But you could see I was kind of targeting, D over the D chord. I think I also targeted A, like the 5th in there. And then when it changed the G minor, I had options there. I could target that G note, obviously. That's part of the chord. But I also kind of waited and then, found a good spot to use that B flat. Like a really expressive, moment in there. You could bend to it, or you could just play it, straight out. Whatever you want to do. But the important thing there is you're targeting, you're thinking of that note related to the chord progression, and then you're targeting that at a very specific time. when that G minor chord happens. We're going to actually target B flat now, so we're going to add that and create a 3-chord progression. So we're going to basically play a 1-6-4-6 progression. We're going to do D minor, B flat major, and then that G minor again, and then back to B flat major. So we're really going to kind of emphasize the B flat. You know, there's really just one D minor and one G minor, and then 2 B flats that come in. And we could play something like this. Just a little progression, you know, you can kind of play over. So we're starting on D. Targeting the D, and then I targeted that B flat, targeted the G, and then I think I targeted the A there to go back to the D. But you could do a big Gilmore bend if you wanted to and bend that B flat. You really want to be sick in there. There's all sorts of crafty things you can do like that, where you can target notes by bending, sliding, tapping. There's all sorts of things you can do. But we're just keeping this really simple so I don't lose anybody and you can see what we're doing. But I'm addressing the chords, you know, as they're playing in that progression, the D minor, and I'm kind of sticking with, you know, some D minor related notes. And you may notice I keep going to this E, which that's technically the 9th, you know, in the key of D minor. That 9th is really expressive too. So that sounds great over D minor. And when you get to that G minor chord, or I'm sorry, B flat major first, when you get there, there's all sorts of stuff you can do. And then when you get to that G minor chord, you can kind of target some of the stuff that we did earlier. Flat actually turns into the 3rd of G right there. So you can kind of recycle that note. And as you can see, we're actually just targeting, you know, depending on what chord we're playing over, and we're hitting like the strongest notes, you know, whether it's the root, the 3rd, or the 5th, or all 3. And then you can start to kind of weave and drift, you know, when the chords start to change. And you can find those related tones, like the common tones, you know, between the chord progression. So D minor, you know, we've got a few notes that kind of repeat themselves, you know, like the note D, for instance. You know, we're going to find that D note in the G minor chord. And we're also going to find that B flat in the G minor chord. And that's part of, you know, that B flat major. So it's really interesting to notice, you know, what happens when you start changing chords right there. And then the chords kind of influence each other, and it really does kind of dictate, you know, where you could steer things as far as a solo or a melodic phrase or a vocal melody or a violin part or keyboard or whatever. But the important thing here is you're thinking about notes, you're mapping things out, you know, at least loosely, to where you kind of see, like, you know, some notes you can target and emphasize. And, you know, it could be a good way to start a solo, or maybe like the end, like a build-up at the end of a solo, or just some phrases, you know, during your guitar solo. I'm going to end this lesson by jamming over the chord progression that we just uncovered. And keep in mind, we just scratched the surface here. We barely got your toe in the pool, but at least I introduced some things and kind of got you thinking about notes and kind of playing over chords and chord progressions. And I am going to use, you know, some of the things that I talked about in this lesson during this little jam, which this is completely just improvised and off the cuff. But this is the type of thing that you want to try to do or strive to do when you're practicing this stuff. You know, try to make, you know, the things that you're playing into a cohesive, you know, musical statement, instead of just moving your fingers around and hoping that you're playing, you know, notes in the right places. But, you know, do something like this. one chord, you can kind of get your footing and kind of see what you need to do. And then as soon as that chord changes to something else, it's going to dictate and change, you know, what your options are and what you can play. And, you know, I'm just really blown away. And a lot of musicians, a lot of guitarists out there, they don't really think about this at all. They just kind of lock on to a pentatonic box or a scale fragment, and they start shredding and moving their fingers around, but they have no idea what they're actually playing, you know, when they're playing it over a chord. And that's something you should definitely think about. And, you know, if you're working on a solo, maybe writing a song, recording something, and you hit something and you can't quite find it, that might be what's happening. Like maybe the chord progression's changing and there's something you're playing that you're not addressing or targeting, you know, and that really does open up some new ideas, opens up some new doors, and it gives your ideas and your music and your jams, you know, as far as your solos, more structure. You know, it gives it a direction and a flow instead of just this wandering, kind of meandering, you know, sound. It actually makes it sound like you're going somewhere, you know, and that's what you want when you're playing a guitar solo. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Midnight Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content material. Thank you.